can we understand the block world in a way that is compatible with possibility, free will, and understand it in a way not necessarily coinciding with the common growing block world model? All right, here's what I have in mind. We think of a block, a square. Say at the bottom, we can write in space, dimensions, 1, 2, 3, right? So the three dimensions of space, which is a frozen space in a block world. There's no real active moving propagation of light, for instance. So even the space is frozen. Right, so then on top of that, metaphorically speaking, of course, we have time as the fourth dimension. But because this time is frozen in its entirety, it's somewhat of a misnomer. Not entirely so, but to a degree it's problematic, right? So we could just as well call this sort of a eternity. Fourth dimension is really eternity. That's not totally satisfying either, because if we think of eternity, right, we would really be hard pressed to include it in a block, right, that has some type of confinement to beginning and end, and then everything in the middle. But in any case, so really, we start off with the three dimensions of space and time as the fourth dimension: frozen space, frozen time. And then famously, as Hermann Weyl wrote, right, we have consciousness crawling across, right, moving across, flowing across the world line or the world tube of a particular individual. And world tube differs from world line in that the line, of course, is not very dimensional. So we fill it out, right, with more dimensions and call it a tube. Now the strongest advocate, as far as I am aware, for the block world, the one who has the strongest arguments is Veselin Petkov. If one wants to argue against the block world, one should focus on Petkov's work, because he has the strongest arguments, in my view. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of all of that, but just to point out in a cursory manner that his arguments for why, and that is how, what we know about the kinematic special effects of relativity actually are impossible in a 3D world with a fourth dimension of flowing, of actually flowing time. That's his argument. So, right, if you want to try to overcome the block world model, use Petkov's arguments and his alone. He has the strongest and the clearest and the most coherent. Now, doesn't mean that this has to be demonstrated. What I'm doing today is a thought experiment, right? We're going to presuppose some kind of basic understanding of a block world and then proceed on a thought experiment to see where it can lead us. Not with the growing block model, as I said, but with an alternative. All right, so if we have three dimensions of space, one dimension of time in the block world, then we have the consciousness, the Weylian, if that's the word, Weylian consciousness crawling across different world tubes, right, of individuals. This would have zero dimensionality. The consciousness would have zero dimensionality, I would argue. And this is important because this is overlaps, right, in a paradigmatic way, in a metaphorical, comparative way with Bohmian holograph, right, that model. So what we want to avoid is transgressing Occam's razor. We don't want to unnecessarily multiply essentiae or essences. So instead of multiplying dimensions, right, the goal is to decrease them. And I believe when we get to consciousness, we've gone from we've gone from 4 down to the 3 remaining space-time dimensions down to 0. We have 0 dimensionality when it comes to consciousness. Now, the 3 dimensions of space and the fourth dimension of time in the block world model, we call this the real. This is what is the real. Whereas the 0-dimensional consciousness, we call it illusion or the illusory. Now, now we need to be more rigorous, right, in our terminology, this real and the illusory. Because what is actually happening with the flow of consciousness from the block world model, it's not necessarily an illusion, right? It's that consciousness is experiencing and interpreting the limited amount of data that is available. So you have the flow of consciousness, and this is consecutive, sequential, and is partial, right? So the consciousness is only a partial amount of temporal data, right, that it's able to access the second by second lapse, right, or experience of time. So this is not necessarily an illusion. It's simply the way the consciousness is experiencing and interpreting. Now that interpretation may not be complete, and in that sense it may not be correct fully. It may be partially correct, but it's not fully correct. But the experience itself, is that an illusion? I would say no. Again, this is really a challenge largely of semantics and of the attempt to be more rigorous than is usually the case when discussing the block world. Right? So the block world is real, and the consciousness which flows through it and produces the incorrect experience and belief in flowing time, right, is an illusion. Well, say one of the problematics there is that this consciousness, which is moving, is part of the block world. So if we want to call it illusory, we have to integrate that within reality. Right? So we have the frozen space-time, 4 dimensions, but then we have a moving 0-dimensional consciousness. In a minute, I'll try to expand on what I mean by 0-dimensionality. Well, go ahead. There must be something that produces dimensionality. And dimensionality can mean many things, but one property, right, that would be shared, right, is some type of structure. Right? It's vastly more complex than just that, but that's one of the core features that we have to deal with in dimensionality is structure, and then you go from there. But consciousness is moving, everything else is frozen. So technically speaking, the block world as such, as a total picture, right, it must include reality and illusion, right? The way things really are, and then a mistaken partial interpretation, right, of the fourth dimension of time. Right, so something real and illusory would have to generate the block world, I think, because this illusory in the block world has something of the real, right? And this real has something of the illusory. Right? So the block world, it's an instantiation of a simultaneous reality and illusion. So we have to stop demeaning the illusory in block world models. And so the experience of free will, for instance, free choice, is, again, just simply a partial way of viewing something that's much larger. So it's incorrect insofar as it is partial. Right? Just as we can commit many misinterpretations, right, from our daily common sense, right? We know our daily common sense does not agree with the actual world in many respects. We can think of time dilation, of solidity of matter, solidity of the table here, and what it actually is, our experience of the solidity, but, you know, on a certain level, right, to see that things really aren't touching. So, you know, what is solidity, right? We have to, you know, we have to be more rigorous, right, when we use terms. All right, so basically, this flowing consciousness is what produces time out of eternity. It's what produces the sense of a flowing time out of the frozen time, which is the fourth dimension of the block world, right? And this time could, from one vantage point, actually be defined as consciousness becoming aware of eternity, right? So time being consciousness, or the experience, right, of the eternally frozen fourth dimension of time, right, as a flowing time, right? So eternity is four dimensional. It's plenary, and because it's simultaneous instead of successive or sequential. All right, so in a nutshell, we have the block world, four dimensions, frozen. Consciousness is moving, zero dimensionality. Now, what produces, what creates the block world? I think we would then have to look at consciousness involving the reality of frozen time and the quote unquote illusion of the flow of time. So we have reality and illusion comprising consciousness. And for such a model of the block world to be equally real and illusory, right, those two features would have to be included in the monistic origin, cause, however you want to understand that, behind the block world. It's counterintuitive. Doesn't mean it's correct or incorrect for that reason, but it really seems counterintuitive that this kind of a model, the block world with consciousness flowing through it, could generate itself. So it really does seem to logically imply a creator, whatever one wants to think of that. But in any case, that creator would have to be both real and illusory simultaneously. The ontology would, of course, be very interesting. It would be a mixture of the eternal, and one hesitates to say temporal, but you know, it's the proto-temporal. What else could you call it? So the creator would comprise reality and illusion, eternity, which has illusion built into it. And that illusory aspect is the basic node in that binary, seen as a unity, right? That basic node from which temporality will emerge at the level of the block world. Now, to sum up with the metaphor of the block world as a movie or a written story, we would then conclude that the so-called illusory features, such as the flow of time, free will, are just as real as the so-called real, the four dimensions, right? The 3 dimensions of space, the 1 dimension of frozen time. So the experience of illusion, right, it is an integral component of the 4D world system, and therefore, in a sense, is just as real. Right? So the story of free will, the story of birth and death, the story of flowing time is an integral component of the 4D block world. But comparatively speaking, it is illusory, and the illusory becomes real. So, do we have free will in a block world? Yes. And what is consciousness doing with regard to free will from that larger perspective? It is becoming it has the illusion that it is making a choice at that time. But behind it is not the negation of free will, but an eternal, but a temporal discovery of an eternally made choice. It is consciousness is reading a story or watching a movie that is real, on one level. So the story was real. It wasn't like a movie that was all fake and fiction. This was an actual story that was somehow generated by some type of creator. And it has this marvelous property of existing eternally. And consciousness takes the book of the story or the movie off the shelf and is able to produce the illusion that's setting it in motion as if it did not exist previously. Right, so the basic idea I'm getting at is that the model of the block world should not inspire us with thoughts such as, oh, we have no free will, so there's nothing we can do to fight pollution, to fight genocides, to defend ourselves and those we love. On the contrary, sort of a passive acceptance of such things would be unethical, immoral, right? But from a larger viewpoint, we see that those noble choices that we make and the ignoble ones that some people have made throughout world history were produced, right, in an eternal mode. And we become aware of them through temporal consciousness. It's sort of mind-bending. I don't know how much farther I can go with this, so I'll end here.